Hello, good evening, and welcome to UFO Paradigm. Today we've got a guest, Franc Milburn, former UK Defence Intel officer, Army paratrooper, 23 years experience in threat risk assessment for clients, for top 500 aerospace government clients, a member of the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. And I think the reason of having Franc today with my colleague Irene, Previn, is to talk a little bit about the recent balloon UFO gate and other things related to UAP, UFO, and military stuff. So welcome, Franc. Irene?
When we mention our interest in studying the UFO phenomena, we still are receiving smirks and giggles. How is it different, or is it different for somebody from a military background as yours when you reveal that you're interested?
It really depends who you talk to. One of my best buddies, he doesn't smirk or laugh at it. He just says he's not interested whatsoever in it. He's watched me a few times on podcasts, but he's just not interested at all. I think most people, it just kind of like passes them by in life. They've got other things to do. I do have a couple of military mates who are very much interested in the topic and who follow it. But talking as I do to people in, who are either currently serving or former military, and the same in the intelligence world, there's a lot of people who take it very seriously. And obviously at the SCU, the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies, if you look at some of the recent videos that they've put on, YouTube, I mean, there's people like, Jay Stratton, John Alexander, Rich Hoffman. It's a whole panoply of who's who in Huntsville and people who are very much immersed in the subject. Eric Davis was there as well in the last SCU conference last year. So from the perspective of insiders, people who've actually worked for the government and in intelligence and the military and in a scientific capacity, it's very much a reality. So there's no smirks there. I don't really bother anyway with people who dismiss the subject. I've got no time really to try and persuade people, and I'm just far more interested in the various phenomena themselves.
So for those, Franc, who have just recently started to have an interest in the UFO UAP phenomenon, I'd like your view on if you think that there's anything new in these recent developments, let's say since the New York Times article about the Nimitz case. Do you think that's anything that's there since then that's really tells us, wow, something is happening? Or is that just the same old sort of, situation since we had Project Sign, Grudge, Blue Book in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and everything is a little bit spinned, and we're not going to get to the end of it anytime soon? What's your view on that?
Well, I think if we're first talking about the press, I mean, New York Times and Politico in 2017, which is two major publications, came out very much in terms of this is happening, and everybody felt that disclosure is going to happen very quickly. I think we've come a long way. I think it is different to the sort of 1950s and the 1960s with Blue Book. I think there's a lot more out the bag, because now we very much have people, insiders who've gone on the record. People that I mentioned in my first paper, that's Colonel John Alexander, Christopher Mellon, Luis Elizondo and others. And now also, people like, sort of Dr. Gary Nolan. And I think it's come a lot further as well now, because there's a lot more scientific buy-in from, they're like the guys at the Galileo Project. And again, Chris Mellon, who I speak to occasionally, and Lou Elizondo are involved with that. And then, if you look at, again, the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies, there's a lot of people there who've worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency, who work for, the UAP Task Force, people who are still currently advising the US government on UAP. So I think now that, UAP has basically become mainstream for science, whereas before, if you look back in history, people like, Class was always debunking UAP. But I think there is a pushback as well. You've seen in some recent articles in broadsheets in America, they've been, kind of ridiculing the whole UFO, UAP phenomenon. So there is some pushback there as well. And I think it's also quite interesting in the recent balloon case, and the objects that were shot down over the USA and Canada, that there seems to be some kind of pushback, and in terms of people who don't want more information to come out, in terms of that they're trying to confuse UAP with balloons before it was, with the the sightings off California, the so-called Catalina sightings. There was, attempt to sort of confuse them with drones with the new swamp gas, and now maybe balloons are being used as the new swamp gas. But I think the genie's slowly being let out of the bottle. I don't think personally that you're ever going to see aliens in formaldehyde and hangar doors being opened and seeing any technologies that the United States or its allies might have retrieved, because I use basically a similar sort of phrase. It's like, you wouldn't expect to go to a British or an American nuclear submarine base and to be shown around all the sensors of nuclear submarine and be explained about all the technologies and all the weaponry and how it works. You wouldn't. So, those are military secrets, and I don't think that those are going to come out unless somebody leaked them. But I find that very hard to believe. That hasn't happened yet, and I don't see that happening. But, I could be wrong.
Agree with you.
Balloons. This is very familiar territory. The powers that be wanted to have us believe that Roswell was a balloon situation. Why do you think balloons are muddying the water here, Frank?
Well, I think it might be for two reasons. One, people who behind the scenes know about the UAP reality, and they are trying to confuse the issue. Just as drones were used in that respect as well. And it's very easy for people who don't follow the topic. It's very easy to put out a piece, say, like, I don't know, in the New York Times, for example, and it ridicules the subject of UAP. And then people who don't follow the topic will go, oh, actually, yeah, I see. It could be a balloon or it could be a drone. But I'm not saying in the recent American case that wasn't a balloon. Yeah, it was a balloon. It was a Chinese balloon that they shot down. And I still keep a very open mind as to the other three platforms that were shot down. I'm looking at a more prosaic explanation than UAP. There's nothing so far that screams out to me and says UAP.
No, and it's interesting because since that happened, I've been thinking there could be different scenarios there, because, and I'm sure you'll confirm that it's not new that spy balloons are, spying on each other. Americans have used spy balloons for many years. So did the Russians and the Chinese and Israel.
That's right.
So forth. So, and I remember hearing about Russian balloons spying on Western Germany during the Cold War, just to check out on NATO installation. So this is not new. So is that because some civilians saw balloons and now the situation got out of hands and it was a political reaction? Joe Biden had to shoot the balloons down, but we had to wait for them to leave the US soils for safety reasons, and then they did, and it was great? Or is that a little bit because now there's a shift maybe from Ukraine to China, maybe, and I'd like to have your views on that. Because Ukraine seems to be a bit of a problem, and it's a money pit. So it's diverting the view from Ukraine to China, and also a bit of that UFO spin. But what's your view on that?
There's a couple of things to unpack there. Yeah, you're absolutely correct. Both the United States, China, and Russia, use these type of balloons. They can equip them for like dropping chaff, basically passive jamming or active jamming, for sort of photo reconnaissance, electronic intelligence, a range of different things, communications relays. I think that the balloon that was downed over the States, off the east coast of the States, that was very much a message to the Chinese. I think that the suggestion is that this has been going on for quite some time, and if you wanted to test the Americans' air defenses, that would be one way to do it without actually using aircraft, because for the Chinese it's very difficult actually to get close to the west coast of the United States. Or the east coast for that matter, unless you're talking about sort of a ballistic missile submarine coming in sort of covertly. But I think it was definitely a message to the Chinese that they were that the Americans were fed up with it, and also as well, I mean, kind of like an admission of failure in a way, because the filters, the NORAD filters, hadn't picked these things up, and if they were allowed to get that close and actually crossing the continental United States, that's quite a significant thing, and it's basically the China was very much, sticking their head in the tiger's mouth, so to speak, by doing that. But I think there'll be some red faces in the Pentagon. People might even lose their jobs over it. The fact that these objects were allowed to penetrate kind of so thoroughly into the United States.
Do you think that they were allowed? I mean, voluntary, or there was an accident? I mean, I still believe that it's been happening for a while, and it's not an issue for the Pentagon, because it's not something that they're going to lose sleep on, but because some people, some civilians saw it, then it became an issue.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not privy to the inner workings, but also as well, by the other way, on the other hand, if you wanted to gather intelligence on, how these, these balloons work and the systems on them, and to gather intelligence on them, then that would be one way. You'd study them. I mean, the objects that were over the United States and Canada, they would have been heavily pinged both by satellite. There were also rivet joint aircraft in the air. So the Americans and to some extent the Canadians would have been sucking up all the kind of electronic intelligence that they could.
So I was listening to Ross and Bryce's podcast recently. The statement there is that the US government still hasn't explained the occurrence of many or the majority of the incidents or the objects that are appearing. What do you have to say about that, Frank?
Sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Oh, just that there are still many unexplained objects appearing. The objects that you're talking about, that you're not convinced that they're UAP, you have some reasons for thinking that they're actually human-based or Chinese perhaps, but there are still many objects that are totally unexplained.
Yeah, I think, well, if you're the American government, you don't want to admit that you have, for example, no capacity to control or to bring down something that's over, in American airspace or in near Earth orbit over the United States, or, operating subsurface in American waters. So I think part of that will be, you don't want to admit as the government that you have no control over that. And secondly, you don't want to admit that you don't know what it is. So I think in a lot of those cases, the American government is still going to be, gathering intelligence on what they are and formulating their own responses. And, they're not going to be sharing that with the public in the meantime, for obvious reasons.
So what are the characteristics of the ones, sorry, just to cut in, sorry about that. What are the characteristics of the ones that have been spotted recently versus the characteristics of what are termed genuine UAP?
I'm not privy to the individual cases, but I would imagine that they're looking at the 5 observable characteristics. If these unidentified anomalous phenomena, if they're displaying 1 or 2 or more of the 5 observables, then that would be then it would be UAP, as opposed to something that has all the characteristics of a conventional aircraft or aerial platform like a balloon.
It seems to me that whatever was shut down was clearly not UFOs in a standard definition of a UFO, and certainly not alien tech, because it's just really never really, I mean, it has happened maybe, but it's really hard to shut down a UFO, and I don't think the US Army or the Pentagon is in that situation now. So it seems to me that there's a bit of a spin going on, and that yeah, I think there's a lot. It's a big situation there that the Pentagon is dealing with, but I think there's a bit of a spin going on there. That's my view.
I was just going to say that's a good point, and that's one of the reasons why I don't think we know that one was a balloon, right, that came down, that was brought down off the East Coast, but the other objects, one, if they were genuine UAP, the American and the Canadian government, through NORAD, wouldn't be talking about it.
No,
okay?
That would be DEFCON. That's right. Yeah,
and especially like the ones that in very remote areas. Okay, the one over Lake Huron, right, people could have seen, but like the other ones were in very remote areas. So you would bring it down, or if it crashed, then you would send a retrieval team, and you wouldn't tell anybody about it. And thanks very much, you've come down in a very remote area. We don't have to tell anybody. Secondly, in terms of actually bringing them down, I mean, they were brought down with conventional weaponry, but my understanding from UAP and what I've written about is you'd have to disrupt the field around the craft in some respect, maybe with an electromagnetic pulse or something similar, before you could actually then use either like a directed energy weapon or a projectile weapon to actually penetrate the hull and affect the hull. I do believe the Americans are working on those technologies. I've got no proof of that, but I certainly would be if something was penetrating, airspace that I was in charge of. I'd want to find a way of mitigating it if it did indeed turn out to be hostile. And I'm not saying that all are hostile, not at all. But I'm saying you have to take it on a case-by-case basis. But you would definitely, in the military, you would definitely be working on that assumption that I have to be able to bring down something that's in my airspace that shouldn't be there. But that's what leads me to believe that the objects, that were brought down over the United States are not UAP, because one, they wouldn't be talking about it, and two, they wouldn't have used conventional weapons to do it.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And also, I've listened to some of your interviews on different podcasts talking about, UAP tech and reverse engineering and exotic technologies. And I am the one who believes that even that kind of exotic tech is probably not used in Ukraine, because I think we would see the impact of that now. And I don't think the conflict would long that much. And when you think about there's half a million troops, Russian troops trying now and ready to continue grinding Ukraine. I believe that if there was any use of these UAP or UFO exotic technologies, that could be potentially against China. And I think the balloon story is a good way as well to shift attention from potentially Ukraine to China and Taiwan, and the whole story about the semiconductors and whatnot. What's your view on that, Frank?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, if the Chinese had the, one or two or more of the 5 observables, then, they'd already be in Taiwan, right? And they'd, completely dominate the South China Sea. I've already talked about, China tech on various podcasts. I mean, and only just now are they getting kind of like their engines for their 5th generation fighters kind of up to spec. They're producing their own engines now, but they're very much reliant on Russian engines before. And, some of the Chinese, so-called 5th generation jets are using kind of like knockoffs of 1980s Russian jets. Yeah. So nothing that screams UAP to me. And also as well, I mean, the Russians, if they had any of the 5 observables, they'd already rolled over Ukraine. They'd probably be at the Channel ports by now. So, and I don't see the Americans having them either, because if they did, then they'd be able to, mitigate that threat. And also, there's nothing. If you look at what the British are producing in terms of 6th generation jets and unmanned so-called loyal wingmen, drones that fly alongside a conventional manned jet. And if you look at what the Americans are producing in terms of their sort of next generation jet, there's nothing that screams to me that this is 5 observable. It's still very much like much more advanced stealth technologies, much more integrated kind of like a sensor fusion and data link communication, and also greater use of drones, right, in conjunction with human manned platforms, but nothing to me that screams UAP. So the Americans might very well have recovered craft. I don't know if they know how to use it, but they certainly there's nothing that tells me that they have deployable squadrons of these craft, because then they would have been used. Some people say that the Americans developed anti-gravity, that they cracked it like in the mid-1950s. Okay, well then, if you're suggesting that, then why has it been kept secret all these years? And then why did the Americans have such massive losses of aircraft in the Vietnam War, both to MiG fighters and also to ground-based surface-to-air missile systems? If you had any of the 5 observables, you would have been all over that, and they would have won. So I always try and balance these things with a bit of logic, because there's a lot of kind of rubbish that goes on in the UFO, so-called UFO community, and these kind of persistent sort of BS, basically, that is kind of propagated from generation to generation, without actually thinking about, well, what's the actual military technology that we have now, what's actually being used in war, and what's actually being produced now. Because if the Americans had this type of technology, why would they be spending billions and billions, developing, their next generation of effectively, jet aircraft, right? We're still using jets. So the stealth gets better, the technology gets better, but we're still using the same technology that, that Sir Frank Whittle invented, was it in 1936, the jet engine, right? It's just obviously evolved, but we're still using that technology. So you wouldn't be spending billions and billions on outdated technology if you could have the best technology, which would be the 5 observables.
And if you spend $1 trillion a year in military expenditure, as the US do right now, it's about $1 trillion a year. You would wonder, if they missed these Chinese balloons, how can that happen? So it's probably not the case. They knew exactly they were there.
Yeah.
Irene.
I have a few questions that you've probably already answered on other podcasts, but because we're on the other side of the world, I'm not sure whether people have caught on to what you've already said. I'm curious for you to share why you are interested in this and what provoked your interest.
My interest, well, I was really kind of brought up with it. My parents were sort of very open-minded, so I was brought up with chariots of the gods and mysteries of Atlantis and all that kind of stuff. And then in the military, I became convinced that UAP were a real thing. Having spoken to various military personnel and pilots, I myself, I worked with I wasn't with the Royal Air Force, but I worked with the Royal Air Force as an intelligence officer. So I was flying in AWACS and seeing like large NATO exercises. But I basically became convinced that it's a reality. Then I kind of I just kept up with the subject over the years by reading books, but it was really sort of 2016, I started getting back into it big time. And then as I would always do with everything, I started, collecting and collating loads of information and analyzing it. And then I decided, actually, I'm so interested in it that I want to start writing about it. So that's really where I am.
And so then can I ask a broader question? Because I think that's what UFO paradigm is all about. It's fairly new. It's only 2 years ago that Irene and I developed that website. But what's your take on the UFO phenomenon? What is happening? And obviously, we know that if people knew the whole story, I think people would probably get scared. So government agencies can't share everything. But and even if they don't understand everything, but what they do understand, they can't share it completely to the public. What's your view on what are we dealing with? When you listen to Jacques Vallée, you listen to the nuts and bolts sort of UFO types or other sub movements in the UFO research space. What's your take on the UFO phenomenon? What is happening?
Well, the truth is, I don't know, and I'd be suspicious of anybody who says they do know. And if you speak to, Dr. Hal Puthoff or Dr. Eric Davis or Dr. Jack Sarfati, for example, you'll get different. They have their preference, whether, for example, Dr. Sarfati, he's into the time traveler hypothesis. It's like future humans. If you speak to other scientists, then they're more inclined towards the extraterrestrial hypothesis. If you speak to Colonel John Alexander, he says, well, it's much more complicated. And he says, well, interdimensional time traveler, ET, I just don't know. And I think it could be a combination thereof. And then, you could have time traveling humans going through wormholes. You could have interdimensional extraterrestrials. I mean, it's only limited by our ability to conceive and to perceive and understand the topic. And I don't claim to understand who they are, where they're from, or when they're from, or what they are. I'm still studying away here, trying to figure that one out. I think we can definitely say that these craft, they are operating on Earth, they are operating on the oceans, and they are operating in space. And if you look at Skinwalker, which is very, very interesting, and I think it's something about episode 5 or episode 4 of I think it's the second or the third season, Colonel John Alexander, and I've spoken to him in private about this. I mean, he says it's very much in terms of a portal at Skinwalker Ranch, and Dr. Jack Sarfati as well is very much of that opinion that there's a portal or portals at Skinwalker. And I think that's one reason why the government doesn't want to talk about it, because the government doesn't want to admit to things like abductions or invisible entities that can exsanguinate cattle, that can zap your dogs, the so-called hitchhikers that follow you around from place to place and cause all kinds of problems for you. They don't want to admit to these things that they have no control over whatsoever. I mean, just take the example of a portal. You've got cryptids, UFOs coming through portals. You've got invisible entities there. So you basically have no control over that, of what's coming into basically American sovereign territory and American sovereign airspace, right? So right there, you've got a problem.
Okay, crash retrievals. Jacques Vallée has released his 5th diary and seems to confirm the Wilson document. I haven't read it yet, but there's a buzz about the crash retrievals being a real thing.
In terms of the Wilson document, I mean, I came on board with that sort of a while ago, mainly when my friend Dr. Bob Maguire when he said that, you know, he'd seen a letter that was given to a colleague of his in the intelligence community by Wilson. And he was basically saying, you know, that he was pissed off that he hadn't been given access to the program that he was trying to get into. So that kind of like nailed it for me. But I spoke to Chris Mellon about this like a while ago, and I mean, obviously he's come out now on the record about it and actually written about it. But he said to me, like, you know, months ago, he said, look, put it this way. He goes, you know, I know both of them. I know Dr. Eric Davis, and my time at the Pentagon overlapped with Wilson. So with Wilson. So you know, and I'll say no more about it. So he wasn't denying it then. And that kind of made me think, okay, yeah, so it is legit, because I asked him directly, but obviously he wasn't ready yet to talk about it.
Do you think, Frank, that, I mean, there's, I think, a lot of science tending into the way that, so every government pretty much in the world has sort of a cell or some type of organization to study UAP, UFOs, potentially from the military or secret agencies or all of the above. What's your view on that?
I can only speak for the ones I know about. If you talk to Robert Fleischer, he says, you know, that the German government has, you know, sort of, or claims to have no interest in it whatsoever. The British have definitely looked at it. I mean, you've got, you know, all this kind of like UFO files that were released, and also Project Condign, which I've written about quite extensively. We know that the Russians or Soviets were interested in it. And there's no reason really to think that would stop now, except for, you know, the fact that the Russians are embroiled in Ukraine, and they don't have a lot of money to spend on, you know, conventional aircraft, let alone kind of exotic programs. But we know that they were interested in it. The Soviets, George Knapp brought back a, you know, a sort of treasure trove from the former Soviet Union. We know that the Chinese military are interested in it, and there's a lot of you know, sort of civil groups as well in China that are interested in it. So yeah, you'd have to be. I mean, you know, if you're a major power and you have the ability to you know, to detect these things, and you know, they're far more advanced than your own most advanced, you know, military aerial platforms, then, and also submarines, then you're going to want to know what they are. So, you know, you'll have some kind of program. I don't know if the Brits, I've been told the Brits do have currently a program like the UAP task force was, or like, you know, ARO is, but you know, I don't have, that's just, I've been told by somebody, you know, in confidence, but I've got no proof or anything to back that up. But I'd be surprised if they weren't, based on what their major ally is doing. And also, don't forget, I mean, if you're talking about, you know, like NATO countries, right? I mean, like, you know, I live near a radar site in Spain, and you know what the technicians in that radar site, you know, if they pick something up, for example, off the coast of North Africa, right? Then that's going to be seen not only in Spain, but it's also going to be seen by, you know, guys sitting in Germany at, you know, NATO, you know, the NATO European headquarters. It's going to be seen by, you know, the Brits and the UK. It's going to be seen by operators as well in the United States and Canada. You know, it's like an integrated air picture, right? So, you know, draw your own conclusions.
So, just quickly, what do you expect from what could you tell us about the Airborne Object Identification Management Synchronization Group, which is, I think, one of the last effort of.
Well, that's no more. Now it's it's ARO. So that's changed. I think it was a bit slack that they were supposed to produce that report for last year, and it didn't come out until this year. I thought that was very slack, and the report was even kind of the first report actually from the Office of Director of National Intelligence. I mean, that was actually quite interesting, even though it was, you know, short. But the second report, once you've taken away like all the acronyms at the end and the introduction at the beginning, there's not a lot of meat on the bone really. And that just tells me, well, they don't want to put the information out there, and still they're probably still flummoxed by what it is. But you know, the whole sort of UAP saga, it didn't start in 2004 with Nimitz, right? And even if you go back, I mean, Lou Elizondo has said, "Oh, why don't you look at more historical cases?" Well, they didn't have such good data back in those days. But even if you go back to, like, you know, the 80s, the 90s, right, and the 2000s, you know, the Five Eyes, you know, the United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they're all part of the Five Eyes network, and they have, you know, very, 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 very good sensors. Okay, that's based on intelligence sharing, but also NATO, you know, very, very sophisticated sensors. So they would have very good data, you know, going back to like the 1980s. I mean, yeah, I can understand why they wouldn't want to maybe look at a case in the 1950s, but there's no reason why they shouldn't be going back beyond 2004. I mean, look at the 1976 Tehran case. That was very, very well documented. So much so that the head of the American, the US Air Force advisory team in Tehran, you know, they actually had a memo that was sent back and was dialed into, you know, all the Joint Chiefs and also to, you know, the White House. Okay, so there's some very good cases going back decades.
Indeed. Irene, maybe just the last question before we let Frank go. And
so I'm
No
just
worries,
going to
mate.
say, thank you very much, Frank, for your time today and very informative discussion.
thank you,
Thanks,
Frank.
guys. Thank you both.